I didn't learn in seminary that people who stole gold from their neighbor, they didn't go to prison. Prisons weren't places where criminals were punished. Prisons, by and large, held two kinds of people: political dissidents and people who were indebted and couldn't repay their debt. So Tom gets thrown into prison, and if Tom's family wants Tom back, Tom's family gets the money that Tom owes and pays off his debt, and they get Tom back. So it changes, forgive us our debts as we forget our debtors. That's spiritualized in my tradition. Our debts are our sins that we can't repay. We can only spiritually abstract that prayer if we don't have a loved one in prison who can't pay their debt, Tom. Because as soon as you have that experience, no spiritual abstraction will help you.
Well, welcome to the Liminal Living Podcast. My name is Dr. Tom, and I am the curator of conversations around here. Sometimes I post some of my own thoughts, and sometimes I like to interview people who have shaped my thoughts or in the process of shaping my thoughts. And today I had such a conversation. I actually just got done talking with Matt Tebbe around the topic of money. Yes, money, but not how you grew up in church listening to what money was preached. We get into the actual political, economic, social underpinnings of Jesus's day and try to look at what Jesus was saying from that vantage point, and then translate that forward into modern day society and show how that mammon, which he calls it mammon, because when Jesus referred to money, he calls it the god of mammon. So he has this too is how mammon works concept that is just, it blew me away today. My brain exploded a couple times. There was like real-time revelation happening. It's like, oh man, didn't see that kind of stuff. I think you're going to enjoy it. But let me introduce you to Matt real quick. He's an expert voice in the areas concerning mammon, which is the Bible's word for the worship of the economy, supremacy, colonialism, authoritarian abuse, all that kind of stuff. And he's also done work in deconstructing those things out of civic society and church. He says really hard things, but really good things. His voice is honest, it's succinct, and it's really helpful. Sometimes it just stings, but you know what? Sometimes you gotta feel the sting so that you know what it is that needs to change. So we welcome to the podcast today Matt Tebbe. He has an MDiv from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. He's done a lot of writing from places like Leadership Journal and Shattered Magazine. He's been featured in the book What Pastors Wish Their Congregations Knew, which was authored by Kirk Fredrickson and Cameron Lee. He's been a prominent voice in thought-provoking platforms such as the Missio Alliance and the V3 movement. And he also co-authored a book, Having the Mind of Christ, which won the IVP Reader's Choice Award. And he's more than just this writer and brilliant thinker. He is a practitioner of transformational leadership. He was co-founder of the Gravity Leadership. He serves as a co-rector at an Episcopalian church known as The Table that is right in the heart of Indianapolis. So we're going to dive into Matt's journey and how he balances it all alongside being married with his wife Sharon and two kids, Deacon and Celeste. So we're going to dive right in, and I introduce you now to Matt Tebbe. All right, well, Matt Tebbe, right? That's how it's
Yeah.
It's Tebbe. Okay, because I've only read your stuff. I haven't heard your name pronounced. That's a problem I'm realizing on Facebook. I'm like, oh wait, how do they pronounce their name? I was calling you Matt Tebbe for a while, and then I heard on Sweeney.
Yeah, I've heard lots of different variations, creative variations of my name, but yeah, you got it right the first time, Tebbe.
Yes, nailed it. Okay, Matt Tebbe, welcome to the Liminal Living Podcast. It's so good to have you here today.
It's great to be here. Thanks.
Yeah, so you just spent a week climbing to the peak of the tallest mountain in the lower 48 states, Mount Whitney. My question is, why did you do that? Sounds like a lot of work.
I have a college friend who has organized, this is the third trip he's organized in the last 7 years, where he's basically living out some of his backpacking mountain man fantasies. So he puts it all together and he organizes and coordinates and sort of pilots the thing, and then we sort of just do what he tells us to do. We show up with our gear and we go for it. And so we've done this twice before in Yosemite, shorter treks, shorter expeditions, but this was by far the hardest. And I don't think I quite knew, Tom, what I was getting into when I said yes. And then doing it, was actually the hardest thing I've ever done physically
Really?
and mentally. Yeah, by far. But it became even more difficult because it was supposed to be a 7-day journey, and the weather on Mount Whitney for the 7th day was so bad that we decided 2 days in to make it a 6-day journey. And so over the final 4 days, we made up an entire day of hiking to get there early.
Yikes. So, I mean, you're saying bad weather and a high mountain. So I'm like, have these Lord of the Rings like images in my head with like snow up to your like neck. Is that what we're talking about here?
Well, it could have been that. Yeah. But we, right at the end, middle of September, we went on the middle of September because that gives it an entire summer for the snow to melt, right? And it's before the first snow. So it's like basically the most clear in terms of ice and snow that it usually is of the whole year. And yeah, we avoided weather that was like in the teens with single digit wind chill and maybe a snow squall. We avoided that weather.
Okay.
And the day we summited, which is the day before that, man, it was so warm, Tom. I mean, when I say so warm, I mean 50 degrees, 45 degrees, super warm up there. It felt great. It was like in no wind. It was gorgeous, completely clear. So it was a pretty awesome time.
So you're saying that it was the hardest thing physically, mentally you've ever done. Is there like a moment where you're thinking on the climb, like, I'm just not going to make it, or I don't think I can do this, what I get myself into?
Yeah. I mean, whether it was a river crossing where, the ranger tells us before we go out, we have to pick up our permit. They make sure we know all the, you have your bear canisters. Do you know how to, how the bathroom works in the wilderness? You know what I mean? Like they have to make sure that they're not just sending, people out with candy wrappers and, their backpacks stuffed with beef jerky, But the ranger that day was like, most people who die on the trail die of drowning.
Oh, really?
And there were 3 river crossings that I legit thought if this could be it.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, one of them we took 45 minutes to plan how we were going to cross because all of them had like a log or some sort of something that or stepping on rocks, but the logs were 4 inches wide maybe, and the river rushing under it was moving fast enough that if I fell in, it would sweep me away immediately and maybe under. And so it was, there were terrifying moments of river crossings. There were I got caught in a freezing rainstorm at 11,000 feet above the tree line, and it was lower 40s, upper 30s, and I had a windbreaker and a t-shirt on.
Oh man.
And it took me 2 hours in a sleeping bag to feel my fingers again. Like, so there were moments like that where it really did feel like, it's not an exaggeration to say, there was coming close to like, coming close to sort of a terminal moment. But then other moments just of hiking on the trail. I'm 47. My heart rate was super high. We had to take lots of breaks. But mentally, my body, I wanted to stop. I wanted to stop walking, and I was working harder than I usually work. I have a nice little sit-down job. And so I'm working harder than I usually work. And, all of this, to use an analogy, the desert fathers used to go into the wilderness and fast or sit on top of stylus poles, and they would do this to do battle with demons.
Yeah.
They would write about how this is the way that they fought their demons. And I really felt like I put my body and my spirit in a place of suffering like that, and all hell broke loose. Like when I started suffering, I wanted to escape. I wanted to get angry. I wanted to blame somebody. I wanted to feel sorry for myself. And none of that would be helpful. And I'm with some of my best friends in the world, and I knew rationally this isn't any of their fault. It's not their fault my headlamp's battery's dead. It's not their fault that my boots are somehow now too small and I have blisters all over my feet. It's not their fault that my boots don't breathe and my meaning they're waterproof, which means they trap water in so that my feet are constantly wet. It's not my fault that um I didn't bring warm enough clothes. All this stuff that was contributing to discomfort and suffering. And I just had to I had to do battle.
Mm-hmm.
I really had to do battle. Physically there were those moments of acute suffering. Most of the time, the suffering, I mean, there was times of it goes an 8 or 9, but most of the time it was like a 5 or a 6. But it was a 5 or a 6 for 12 straight hours. And so, as I talk about this, listeners are probably thinking, why would you ever do this? Well, it was gorgeous. We did the High Sierra Trail and we saw things that you can't see any other way but being on this trail. And it was amazing. And being on top of Mount Whitney and looking over one side, we looked over the Mojave Desert. And the other side, we looked out over the California Sierra Nevada mountains. And it was just amazing. Mojave Desert, like Death Valley. Man. It was just gorgeous. Just gorgeous.
Man, so what was the best part of it all?
Well, my friend, so I'm dealing with my own stuff. Everybody's dealing with their own stuff. My friend who planned the trip has this condition where his eyelid will occasionally slice his cornea while he's sleeping.
Oh, I don't like this condition.
Nope. And he had laser surgery a couple of years ago to kind of resolve some things. Well, the day before we summited Mount Whitney, we had to get up at 4 a.m. to do it. We had to walk. Everybody had a headlamp except for me because my headlamp was dead. But we had to hike the first 2 hours in the dark. And that night he cut his cornea. Oh. So not only did he not get any sleep, he also is photosensitive. So the other 2 times he's done this, he's had to lay in a dark room and basically for 2 days because he gets headaches and any light makes him disoriented and nauseous. Well, he doesn't sleep, wears some sunglasses, and hikes the last 5,000 miles straight up over 7 hours to get to the summit of Mount Whitney with a sliced cornea. And I think the best thing was the way that his, I think, greater suffering than anybody else enabled me to tap into like a reserve that I didn't think I had. And we took care of each other, man. Like we got to take care of him. And my friend Chris was in a lot of pain, but you wouldn't have known it because of how positive and how encouraging he stayed. He asked for what he needed, so we stopped frequently, but there was no feeling sorry for himself. There was no, spreading sort of his misery around to us, but we were able to bear up underneath of him. And just that camaraderie, that banding together, that bearing with one another. I don't get to experience that very often in everyday sitting down life, and it was precious.
Before we jump into some stuff that I want to talk about, can you just describe your roots as an individual, who you are and the soil that you came out of? Maybe, where you grew up, how you grew up, and how you found and engaged the faith for the first time.
Yeah. I grew up in Indianapolis, Indiana, on the south side, which is I understand now, as an adult, was kind of a second people whose parents had been on farms or dirt poor blue collar workers. Their children populated the south side. So very provincial, very frugal, and what I would describe now as a lot of trauma around money, around addictive family systems and those kinds of things. And so I grew up on the south side of Minneapolis. I was raised Roman Catholic with my two younger sisters. My parents got divorced when I was 6, which was a fairly traumatic, significant happening in my life. And I spent the first 18, 19, 20 years or so kind of a nominal Catholic. We went to church every week. I was confirmed did my first communion. But God was just sort of, I would put God in the same category as like Shakespeare and caviar.
Okay. A little bit beyond.
One of the finer, it's like a important people think about and talk about these kinds of things. And I could wax whimsical about God, right? I could talk about God. I knew a lot about God, but there was no imagination or awareness of how God wanted to make a difference in my life. What was Christianity for? There wasn't any, I wouldn't have been able to answer that question. But then I fell in with some rather zealous and kind college students who were a part of a student-run fellowship ministry that loved the hell out of me. They really, I remember being kind of impressed and intrigued by the way that they lived. Like the quality of their life was superior to mine. I had this sobriety about that. And I think my conversion then, if we want to call it that, I was baptized when I was a baby, so, and then Jesus died 2,000 years ago, so who knows when I was saved, you know what I mean? but one of my conversions in college was deciding I want to learn how to live like this. And that meant following Jesus and learning to live from Jesus. And so that started me on a long journey, Tom, when I was about 20, trying to figure out, what does this mean? Am I Catholic still? It took me a couple of years to realize at the time, this is late 90s. There wasn't really, the Catholic Church has gone through kind of a renaissance maybe, or a rejuvenation. There's a lot of very passionate followers of Jesus in the Roman Catholic Church, but in the 90s where I lived, I couldn't find anybody. So I sort of sought out, like, who can I band together with, to follow Jesus? And so I went through a myriad of denominations, serving in different capacities, and finally, 25 years later, have ended up as an Episcopal priest, which sort of brings together the Protestant Reformation and my Catholic upbringing and holds them sort of close and tries to bear the tension well. So I don't know, man. That's 47 years and 4 minutes.
Yeah. Hey, you did good. Like, if you're writing a little bio of your entire life, I think that covered it. Now, you mentioned, you fall into these very zealous, young Christians that kind of pulled you into their wake. And I find that zealous people do that. They like leave a wake behind them, and it's like you're either knocked out of the way or you're pulled along with them. How would you, what exactly, like, how would you describe that zeal? What was it centered around? What was so attractive about it that it didn't push you out of the way, but drew you in?
I guess two things. One is I experienced sort of an acceptance and a welcome from them that was was out of the ordinary for me. I had been a performer. I went to school for theater and music, and I was used to having friendships that were informed by, like, people wanting to be around me because of what I could do. Sort of like we're both impressed by each other, and so we're going to hang out. But these people didn't know didn't know if I was talented or how talented I was. They also weren't impressed by intelligence or anything else, right? There was like a really, I think it was an encounter with like gracefulness, like graciousness. I don't know. I was really attracted to that.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to learn how to live like that.
Okay.
Most of the people that I had been around to that point didn't treat me that way. And so I was treated in a unique way that was appealing and attractive. And, I enjoyed it,
Okay.
I guess you could say. And it's probably the best way to describe it briefly.
I gotcha. Now, from that moment until now, I'm sure you've done a lot of growing and evolving, because everybody does that naturally. Is there a moment that like gave you this, like a passion and a vision for that transformational style of leadership that you've been so central in, gravity leadership? Is there a moment that was the spark for, oh, there's leadership, but then there's leading from this transformed place? Like, how did you come to that knowledge?
Yeah. I think that got clarified through some suffering, to bring it maybe back around to the crucible and the gift that suffering can be from my trip I just took. About 9 years ago, I took a position at a large Christian organization. And this is 2014, and this is before really I knew the words like church abuse. I mean, we weren't talking. I didn't hear anything about church abuse 9 years ago.
Yeah.
This is right at the beginning of the Me Too movement, before the Church Too movement, before, Bill Hybels and Ravi Zacharias and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And I didn't have language like narcissist or even toxic leadership. Like this just wasn't in my lexicon. Like I think many of us, it wasn't in our lexicon.
Yeah.
And I encountered a pretty awful, rotten leadership situation where the ministry started to go south, and the people who worked for it were blamed and gaslighted and scapegoated, but then told that they were being given gifts even though they were being fired. Like it was just this really. I remember sitting in an office with some coworkers, and once or twice a day, we would look at each other and we would say, "Is this really happening? Is this what happened? Did this just happen?" Kind of like this reality distortion field we were living in. A few years later, I realized I was diagnosed with PTSD, and I think that that contributed to it. And I honestly think, Tom, that experience was an experiential Ebenezer for me, like this pregnant, immovable memory of what happens when we don't take love seriously as Christians. When our understandings of authority and power aren't reckoning with love, but they're centered on other things like control or charisma or impressiveness or success or effectiveness or persuasion. And I feel like in my body stored up the cost of what a lack of love does, the harm, the hurt, the injury it causes. And I think that was a moment for me where I was like, if I'm going to continue leading in churches or Christian organizations, and heck, if I'm just going to continue being a Christian, then I've got to figure out what difference love can make, because I don't want to hurt people unintentionally the way that I've been hurt. I actually think we're told in the New Testament that we're supposed to be able to be known by our love. And I realized I didn't really know the first thing about what that meant. All I knew is that we weren't known by our love. And so that's really, that moment solidified a conviction for me, but also a sensitivity for me. I think about how worldly power works. And I began to be able to see better and perceive better and have empathy more for the ways that ungodly or worldly power are used in unjust ways, which then was sort of this beacon I could hold on to as a contrast to how love is supposed to live. So does that make sense, man? Like,
Oh yeah.
I think that was the important moment for me.
Yeah, I'm tracking, and we've had some other folks on, and they've talked about their experiences with church abuse. And I find it really interesting. He said we just didn't have language for that even 10 years ago, which is like mind blowing to me that we're just now finding words for this. I used to idolize someone like a Mark Driscoll back when I was a youth pastor in like 2010, 2008 to 2010, and just think he was just the greatest thing ever. Because look at what he's doing. Look at what he's producing, and he says it with a little bit of edge. And I think that's really cool. And then, lately there's been this whole deconstruction around that style of leadership and saying, well, look at the cost, that whole rise and fall of Mars Hill podcast, like, was a kick to the gut to me, because not just because like, oh, look at Mark, he did a whole bunch of bad things, but it was like, wow, look at the style of leadership I was taught to exercise, that I was taught we need these results. And if we don't get these results, you don't have a job, so,
yeah.
And then to get those results, you have to then implement the style of leadership that can damage folks. And I have damaged folks with that leadership. And I've had to go back and apologize and just say, I didn't know. This is just how I was taught to do this job. And now I think I've swung the pendulum so far the other way that it's just like, now I'm afraid of my voice. I'm afraid of exercising power, authority, because it's like, I do have a position of authority being a pastor, and I want to use it well. I want to help people, but I don't want to wound people. So I'm like, I want to stay small as a church, just because I don't want to get caught in all of, because if you get big, then you got to do certain things to stay big and to even travel there. And it's just like, I'm terrified of the path that leads there, because I see the bodies on the side of the road of the other paths I used to take. And I don't want to do that anymore.
Yeah. I can relate to that, man. Totally. I think it's, to use a metaphor, and just trigger warning that I'm thinking of a violent metaphor. So, if the only way you know how to touch somebody is to punch them, and then you realize that punching hurts people, sometimes we then try to stay as far away from punching as possible.
Yeah.
Which means we don't even touch people. Right?
Yep.
And now we're no longer punching them. But staying away from punching doesn't get us any closer to learning how to touch people virtuously. Mm-hmm. It just means we're not touching people unvirtuously. And I think I use that as a metaphor because it's sort of a preschool kind of example of, I think that for many years, I too tried to stay away from Mark Driscoll, hoping that I would, and Mark Driscoll here is a caricature, right?
Yes.
He's a cipher or a symbol. Hoping that would get me closer to being a good leader. But for me, I realized that part of in any arena, as a dad even, if I just try not to be a bad dad, that doesn't make me a good dad. Like there's no vision of the good there, because when I try to stay away from being bad, usually I'm just passive. I'm hands off. I opt out. And you and I both know that there's arenas in our lives where I actually have to engage my agency.
Yep.
I have to own that I have a voice, that that I need to use my agency here for the sake of other people. And so that's basically why we started Gravity, is because I didn't have an imagination for what that was, Tom. Other than being kind of nice. Just trying to be nice.
Yeah.
Which felt sub-Christian.
Yeah. Oh, and your voice, like I started following you on Facebook. I think I saw you posted by somebody else, and I thought I need to listen to this voice. And I'll be honest, your voice can sting sometimes, but it's because I'm learning a new way of being, and I need to be stung in that area. You say things that are so succinct and clear in a way that is not hostile, but still it's like, oh, that one got me, because there's some residue left of that former style of leadership somewhere in there that is not yet healed.
Yeah.
And when it's kind of like my mechanic, he washes his hands with brake cleaner to get the grease off, and he'll just spray it on there and he'll do this. And he's like, oh, there's the cut. Because it stings when the brake cleaner gets in a cut. He's like, right. You don't realize where the cuts are until the brake cleaner goes on. And then you feel the sting, and it's like, oh, there's a cut. I should probably clean that out with something that's not brake cleaner. And that's kind of like your voice on Facebook for me is like, I'll read it and it's so helpful, but sometimes it's like, ow, that one stung. Sure. And you get a lot of pushback from people who don't know how to be stung in a way that's introspective and say, why did that sting? Let me look at myself. And they just get offended.
I think I'm trying to mature out of a hesitancy or a reticence to stay silent until I'm absolutely certain I'm right.
Ooh, yeah, that one hurts. You see this? There's this thing.
Yeah. To be very carefully nuanced so as to not give the impression that I am biased at all, when of course I'm biased.
Stung me again.
And 3, if I'm going to make to learn in public, to learn out loud, because Tom, if you and I are both pastors, we're supposed to have mastered divinity. We're not allowed to learn or change.
Yeah.
Which is one of the reasons why we have such a leadership problem, is because there's no freedom to be wrong. So 4, not only learn in public, but be wrong in public. And 5, if I'm going to make a mistake, it's not going to be because I was silent about the right thing, but I spoke out trying to be about the right thing and was wrong. I just realized that I was living in fear and living in this need to not be seen as wrong or bad or misguided. And that was helping me, but it wasn't helping the poor, the least, the marginalized, the last. It wasn't helping them. I was justifying myself and dressing it up piously versus risking audaciously for the people that Jesus says are blessed, and risking being wrong in doing that. And I don't know. I don't know what it was. I think it was my exasperation of living in kind of a sick culture, and being, middle class, able-bodied, cisgendered, white, male, Christian pastor, and feeling like, what do I do with this? What do I do with all that? I don't want to despise all these identities that afford me privilege. How do I leverage that privilege in love? And so I just want to name that it's all an experiment, man. I'm just trying to experiment in a different way than I've lived hitherto, right? Up till now. And so one of the things that I've come to realize was really important to Jesus is what he calls mammon. Now, mammon is the Aramaic word for money. right? But the reason I use the word mammon is because a lot of translations talk about, and this is in the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus says, you cannot serve both God and mammon. You either love the one and despise the other, or hate the one and love the other, right? And I think it was, I don't remember when it struck me, but a couple things happened. One, I started reading Black scholars, non-white scholars, about the socioeconomic condition of Jesus and the majority of Israel in the time of Jesus. And I came to realize that the vast majority of people in Israel, more than 90%, were living hand to mouth. We're living in an imperial colonial rule where they had to pay taxes to Rome, where they had to pay taxes to Herod, and they had to pay taxes to the temple. And they were like being all their wealth and life was being extracted from them by systems of tyranny and oppression. And I realized that that's not my life at all. I pray, give us this day our daily bread, and I spiritualize it. The people Jesus taught to pray that materialized. And so the second thing is I realized that I had inherited a faith that, as a product of modernity, so this is a modernity thing, I think, Enlightenment modernity, I'd inherited a faith that I thought of primarily as a spiritual thing that was private, personal, and internal. So what matters most is the heart. What matters most is my, inside, how I feel, what I think. And there's an abstraction or a spiritualization of things like give us this day our daily bread. Or I've come to proclaim good news to the poor. Who are the poor? Well, the spiritually poor, like the spiritually poor.
Yes.
Right? And I increasingly learned from people who were Christians, who had material real world needs, that way of being in the world was a product of largely the modernity and the Enlightenment. Scientism and rationalism claimed the material world as the domain of science and sort of squeezed religion or spirituality out of it. Right?
Yeah.
Now, this is a complex thing I'm trying to I don't even fully understand it, but I'm just trying to give an idea here. And so what's different about the text of Scripture and me is that Jesus there was no bifurcation between material and spiritual.
Mm-hmm.
So for Jesus, the material is spiritual. For Jesus, the realm of faith is material, communal, public, external. So what difference does this make? Well, it means that when Jesus stands up in Luke 4 and he says, I've come to proclaim good news to the poor, right? Release the captive, recover your sight to the blind, and set the oppressed free, right? I tend to spiritualize that.
Yeah.
Those are all spiritual conditions. So, and I learned a gospel that Jesus died for the spiritual condition of blindness. Jesus died for the spiritual condition of captivity, right? But if you read the Gospels, so Jesus then died for our sins, right?
Mm-hmm.
But like, what sins did he die for, if not for the ones he said he came to reckon with?
I'm tracking.
And so you tracking with me?
I'm tracking.
So I started to try to reintegrate my actual everyday real world with my spiritual life. Because it seems like Jesus operated not trying to get people to escape out of their real life into heaven, but he came to establish a kingdom. I think a better word for that for us, because kingdom is, we haven't used that word to describe real world things since the Middle Ages, right? So I like to call it the political economy of God.
Mm-hmm.
And when I do that, I begin to see that that Jesus wants to make claims on our everyday material, physical, corporate, communal, external life, public life, on how we are human together. And when I realize that the only God Jesus mentions, other than Father, is Mammon. I have to figure out what Mammon is. And how does it relate to this reintegration of my spiritual life with the material world? Yeah?
I'm tracking.
I can over-answer any question, Tom, and I think I'm doing a pretty good job with this one. So,
I said, I'm tracking. Like you're building something, and I'm following along.
Great. Yeah. Jump in and ask questions or get clarification, because this makes sense in my head, but I don't often piece this together to build it.
Well, you said Jesus only spoke of two gods, Father and Mammon. I want you to talk more about that.
Yeah, I think that Jesus talks about money or mammon all the time. Even things like, setting the prisoners free. I didn't learn in seminary that people who stole a watch, sorry, watch didn't exist. People who stole gold from their neighbor, they didn't go to prison. Prisons weren't places where criminals were punished. Prisons, by and large, held two kinds of people. Political dissidents who were awaiting trial and execution.
That's namely Barabbas.
Yep. And people who were indebted and couldn't repay their debt.
Mm-hmm.
Debtor's prison. So what would happen is, if you couldn't repay a debt, you took out a loan, you couldn't repay a debt, you'd get thrown into prison as a ransom. So Tom gets thrown into prison, and if Tom's family wants Tom back, Tom's family gets the money that Tom owes and pays off his debt, and they get Tom back.
Now, I think you posted that earlier on Facebook this week, and it like entered my brain and has been there ever since, rattling around. But then I couldn't remember if it was you who said it, and I did want to ask you if it was.
Yes,
and it was,
yes.
And that I think I actually made mention of that in my podcast or in my sermon from last Sunday. I can't remember.
Awesome.
But holy cow, yeah,
it changes everything. Then
it does.
What it means. So it changes. Forgive us our debts as we forget our debtors.
Mm-hmm.
That's spiritualized in my tradition. Our debts are our sins that we can't repay. Right. But Jesus is giving a prayer to pray to poor people about how to live in his political economy, one where we don't punish retributively those who can't repay debts, but we forgive so we'll be forgiven, so that the very fabric of our life isn't ripped apart in a tit-for-tat zero-sum economy. We can only spiritually abstract that prayer if we don't have a loved one in prison who can't pay their debt, Tom. Because as soon as you have that experience, no spiritual abstraction will help you. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I think that's where white evangelical culture has to spiritualize these things, because we aren't experiencing as much the oppressive nature of mammon like those on the margins. And so we don't know the experience, and so we have to find a meaning for it. So it must be spiritual. And then we look at, I grew up in Detroit, near Detroit, and I remember having an inner city black man as a professor. And I'm like, this guy's faith is absolutely different than mine. I don't understand where he's coming from. You know, he even votes Democrat. Like, how can you be a Christian and do that? It was so confusing to me how, and then I started to learn, like, their world is different. Their experience is different. And these experiences are finally, like, there's safe places to talk about them in public squares in ways that I can then learn from and say, oh, this is why things have been so different. Yeah. And so, yeah, that whole spiritualization versus materialization of, like, that Mammon system. Like, if they would have just practiced Jubilee, like, they could have dodged this all, like, every 49 years, just forgive all the debts. But instead, they made this landowner system where, you know, your great-grandfather's vineyard now belongs to this landowner, and you have to go work for the landowner and do the work of the landowner, but on the land that used to be your family's land, but he gets the money for it and you just get a little bit. And it's like, when you understand, like, the political, cultural, societal structure, and then you read the scriptures, it's like, and you don't spiritualize everything. And it's not just about getting into heaven and dodging hell, but, like, it really, like, just rocks your world when you understand the political implications, the economic implications of what Jesus is saying most of the time. And then we, you know, don't have that experience, having a lot more of the cultural power being, you know, white dudes. So we got to find some kind of a meaning for it. So we spiritualize it and then we miss it.
Yeah. Yeah, we miss it. And yeah, I'm glad you pointed out that how you learned some of this stuff, because that's how I learned it too. I had to learn how to listen to people not like me who had a similar social location to the people who wrote scripture and who scripture was written to. Right?
Yeah.
And that helped unlock some things for me.
Yeah.
That helped unlock some things for me. So coming back to, and by the way, I mean, I don't think it's a, you know, Martin Luther famously called the Epistle of James an epistle of straw. Remember, I don't know if you ever heard this. Like,
I didn't actually. Yeah,
he famously wanted to relegate it to, like, the rubbish bin of the New Testament.
And, yes, I do remember that now.
And part of that's because, you know, James explicitly says the opposite of what Martin Luther did, right?
Yeah.
Faith without works is dead. But also James goes pretty hard after those landowners you were talking about.
Mm-hmm.
He goes after them pretty hard. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the one of the books in the New Testament that can't be spiritualized. It's clear James is saying, aren't the rich the ones who drag you into court? Aren't they the ones who put you in prison because you can't repay your debts, is what James is saying.
Mm-hmm.
He's also saying, woe to those landowners who make laborers work the field and don't pay them equitably, justly, righteously, right? So, you know, 500 years ago, Martin Luther didn't need the word Marxist to have a problem with that stuff. Because it violates the logic of Mammon. So getting back to that then, Tom.
Yeah.
I was taught that when Jesus says you can't love God and money, or God and Mammon, that what that means boils down to, tell me if you've heard this, Tom. Basically, I can have as much money as I possibly can as long as I don't love it more than God.
That's pretty spot on to what I was taught as well.
Right?
Yeah.
And so, and then sometimes that gets, there's edges on either side of that. You know, there's the edge of, you have to make sure that you give X amount of money and then the rest is whatever. God owns it all, but what does that mean really? Like, you get to spend it the way you want. Just be God wants to make you rich, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so all you need to do is do these spiritual practices or pray these prayers or make sure you give 10% and then God will bless you abundantly, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I realized that's not really how Jesus talked about money. First of all, love doesn't simply mean have warm feelings for.
Mm-hmm.
Love is a committed loyalty. Love is a intercovenant with. Love is be shaped by and ordered by, right? And so that's the first thing. The second thing is we were talking earlier about, you were mentioning you have a small church because a larger church brings with it sort of ways of being that feel like they would compromise some of your integrity and convictions, right?
Yep.
And I want to say that a lot of our assumptions and habits, a lot of the logic whereby large organizations run is colonized by our predominant prevailing political economy, right? Industrialized, neoliberal, finance-driven capitalism.
Yeah, you have to operate in that sphere to be that church.
Yes. Well, yes. And it's not something that we choose. So this is where some white evangelical conceptual tools, to borrow a phrase from Emerson and Smith in their book Divided by Faith, there's this free will expressionism, so for instance, it comes out, Tom, like if I was racist, I would know it. I love black people. There's no way I can be racist, right? As though white supremacy needs our consent to be operative, right? So part of the operating system we run on is we think, unless I've chosen it volitionally, explicitly, I'm not culpable of it. Right? And that assumption isn't true.
Yeah.
It's not true. I mean, how many times have we heard people who are abusive towards women, verbally, physically, defend themselves by saying, I love women. I've got a mom. I've got sisters. Look at how many women are saying I love them, right? So all that to say, I began to mistrust that Mammon has primarily an interior, private, personal, internal, abstract regnancy. But Mammon actually orders and shapes our relationships, our possessions, our family, our work, our time, what we think success is, what we value, how we answer the question, what are people for?
What are people for?
What are people for? So just one real concrete artifact about what that looks like. Almost every church I've worked in has used the metaphor of family to describe the relationship of the church. We're a family. We're a church family.
Yep, that's pretty common.
Yeah. But almost every single one of those churches that I've worked for has fired somebody on their staff. Firing somebody isn't a part of the political economy of God. It's not a category in the kingdom of God. Jesus didn't fire Judas, for Christ's sake.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
He served him communion.
He sure did. And so, but firing is a part of an industrialized Western capitalistic neoliberal finance-driven economy. And that's one example of how we bring an assumption, not volitionally, explicitly, but implicitly. Mm-hmm. Just, we all know that you fire somebody when they do something wrong or underperform, etc. And I think that's there's like 10,000 examples like that where we're running on a different operating system than the political economy of God.
Yeah.
We've absorbed naturally, we've come by it honestly, a different logic, a different common sense, a different operating system. 98% of it is out of our awareness.
Yeah.
And that, I want to say, that is where Mammon is regnant. That is where Mammon has dominion. That is how Mammon asserts its hegemony. And it's been a discipline or practice for me to excavate that. Like I just did with the firing thing.
Yeah.
You know? I don't fire my sister.
This too is how Mammon works. Like every time you write that phrase, you're exposing part of that 98%. That's unseen. It's like, oh, there it is again. There it is again. Yeah. There it is again.
And I'm doing it for me.
Yeah.
Like I'm doing it for me because I'm learning in public is going back to that. I'm trying to learn in public and saying, do you guys see this? Am I nuts? Am I crazy? Right? We see this, right?
Yeah.
That kind of thing. So Jesus talked about mammon, family, and work, which are all three related in his day, by the way. They're sort of overlayering arenas. They're not separate things like they are for us. They're overlayering one arena. He talks about family, work, and money all the time, nonstop. And what he's trying to do is he's trying to help people whose imaginations, whose minds and paradigms have been formed and shaped by colonial empire, extractive, oppressive colonial empire, and recolonize or restore their imagination for how to live in God's political economy, which he frames as Jubilee.
Yeah, he does.
And I think I'll just say the final thing about this for now is that I think that he sees a Jubilee political economy of God as directly opposing and resisting the political economy of Mammon. It's a deeply material, public, communal, external thing that involves our affection, time, and attention, but transcends that. Transcends it into how we order our very lives. So I'm trying to do that work for myself so I can stay a Christian.
Yeah, I hear you on that one, because there is so much of that colonial mindset like just baked into the pie of Western Christianity that's like, how can you not consume, like you're eating bread, you can't just like take out the egg from the bread. It's baked in, and it's really hard to like differentiate. Okay, well, this is colonialism speaking, and Jesus was actually talking this way, and we've interpreted it this way, and that's what your posts do. And I think you really nailed something on the head. Do you mind if I read one of your quotes here?
Sure, dude.
Okay. This is a little bit of a longer one, but I think you're really getting at something really crucial here. It says, Mammon preys on the fear of death, but God delivers us from its grip so we can face and befriend death. Mammon offers products, pills, procedures, diets, routines, workouts, and injections to deny the inevitability of mortality. Mammon preys on our mortality, using and extracting human capital to maximize profit at the expense of health and vitality. The logic of Mammon simultaneously creates a culture of death and hinders our ability to face it. It's Antichrist logic at work in our world that uses people to use other people so people can accumulate things to use. It's dehumanizing, extraction, commodifying, objectification, all the way down. I think that is the most succinct definition of Mammon that I've encountered. Because the Roman Empire used crucifixion as the threats, you know. If you're gonna rebel, you're not gonna pay your taxes, and then look at what we do. And they hang people on the road, and little kids walking by and families on the road. They have to watch these people in agonizing death. Like sometimes it takes a week for them to die. And, when they rose up in the town of Sepphoris, when Christ was a child, Rome came through and like crucified thousands of people. And so if Jesus had to walk, on the road with his dad to work, because he would have had to rebuild Sepphoris, he would have been like seeing thousands of people just dying in agony on the road for like an entire week. And this is how Rome like used that fear of death to control the people. And now you switch out fear of death and you put in fear of hell. And it's like, has not the church used hell and original sin and threats and guilt and shame to just like take this mammon God and like as a golden calf and just say, hey, y'all better get in our buildings and give your money and stay here because there are consequences, folks.
Yeah, Tom, you said it really well. And I don't remember saying or writing what you just read. If you could send that to me, I'd love to read it again. I trust that I wrote it, but I don't remember writing it.
It was on your Facebook page.
Anyway, again, that's me trying to name and work out like this intuition or this suspicion, trying to name, because I really do feel like it's a prison, and I'm trying to, in darkness, make out the walls with my hand,
Yeah, that's
trying to feel how this keeps us caged. And I think profit is another, PROFIT is another way that mammon reigns or works, is that everything can be justified as long as there will be or is perceived to be a profit. I mean, this is the problem with having a finance-driven capitalistic system, which means we no longer make money selling shoes. We make money off the perceived stock value for the next quarter of the shoe company. So it doesn't matter if we're making good shoes, where the company's located is a good neighbor, provides good jobs, etc. What matters, what CEOs get hired and fired for, is whether or not the stock price is perceived to be on the up for the next 3 months, and shareholders are going to get a good return. So we're making money off of perceived future value, right? Which the reason why that's an issue is because so many things can get justified based upon assuring that the shareholder price, the stock price, has the perception that it's on the rise. That's all that matters. It's all that matters.
Yeah. Was it you that said, if you switch out, when they talk about the stock market, when they talk about the economy, just switch out that word for rich people's yacht money and you're still saying the same thing? Rich people's yacht money has gone up today. Oh, it's come down today. And everyone rises and falls on this thing called the stock market. And if you just take out the phrase and insert rich people's yacht money, it still makes sense. I don't feel it when the stock market goes up or down. I don't feel a thing.
You know what? No, I don't either. I was just in California on this hike, and gas was almost $6 a gallon.
Holy cow.
It's $4 a gallon here, almost. My groceries are 50% more than they were before COVID.
Yep.
We just bought a used car. It was crazy expensive. Everything that all consumer goods are crazy expensive right now, and companies are making record profits. But this is how Mammon works. What's blamed isn't profiteering or price gouging by corporations. No one holds record profit companies accountable because they're delivering stockholder shareholder value, which is what our political economy is set up to do. What's blamed for high gas prices, high grocery prices, is this thing called inflation. But inflation only exists because we want it to.
I don't want it to exist.
I don't either. But you know
someone
who wants
does.
It to exist? Well, you know who wants it to exist are the companies who have to increase their return every quarter.
Yeah.
So inflation is necessary, vital, crucial in the political economy of Mammon.
Yeah.
But in a political economy of God, the most important thing isn't perceived future value of stock prices. The most important thing is Tom and his family flourishing. Do Matt and Tom have the appropriate binds and ties to sustain not only themselves economically, but relationally, physically, psychologically, emotionally? And if they don't have that, how do we use what we all have to ensure that happens? That's such a different bottom line, man.
Yeah.
You know? Because just because Shell Oil is making record profits doesn't mean Tom's life is better. Doesn't mean Matt's daughter with diabetes can afford her diabetes medication. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I think I'm trying, all this to say, I think I'm trying to reclaim Jesus's teachings about family, work, and money as the biblical teaching of what we should be holding on to. And I'm not shocked by this, but I think it is striking that when you quote word for word things Jesus has said and put it in the context of when Jesus lived, that you get called, I've gotten called a liberal, which there's nothing wrong with being a liberal, but the gatekeepers of the Bible don't like the Bible.
Yeah, they like it as a weapon. They like to wield it to hold on to the power that they have.
Yes. Yeah.
But they don't like what it says. And so they teach you what they think it says. And then they threaten you with death when you don't agree with them.
Yeah.
And there's Mammon again.
Yeah. 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 I mean, that's using religious power to consolidate and solidify your own power, even if it means scapegoating people who talk about scripture in a way you don't. I mean, this is John 11, man. This is the logic that led to Jesus's death.
Yeah.
Jesus threatened the alliance of religious people with empire, and they realized that if they don't do something about it, that they're going to lose their power and their city and this. And so they eliminated a threat. And religious people who trade on, you can call it mammon, but the power of empire, religious people who trade on the power of empire do the same thing today.
Yeah.
It's the same thing.
Yeah. Yeah. I've been there in that camp where it's like, oh, this is how we're supposed to do it, because here's the tips, here's the tricks, here's all the people being successful, here's how you grow it, and somewhere along the way, I read Seth Godin, his book Tribes, and
Tribes.
I don't remember much from that book, but there was a phrase in there. He says, "Be as small as is sustainable," and I'm like, there is a lot of wisdom in that, because how I was taught to do things is scale, 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 scale. But the compromises you have to make to your voice, your character, in order to get to the next level and the next level and the next level. This is exactly what Jesus was talking about. What does it profit if you gain the whole world, but you have lost your soul in the process? And again, we spiritualize that. What does it profit? If I never went to church, or I never accepted Jesus in my heart, but I became a very rich man. It's like, no, if I have compromised myself, my values, my identity, and my voice just to get something that I thought was important, then there's a lot of recovery that I'm going to have to do in order to gain my soul back.
Yeah.
And that I've been on that journey for the last, 14 14 years or so, I had to get a masterate and a doctorate in spirituality to figure this out, because I was just so messed up in the head, just being drowned in the waters of fundamentalism.
Yeah.
And it's like, now that I can see things differently, and even after, reading people like James Cone, like The Cross and the Lynching Tree, it's like that transforms my understanding of the cross and that event. You read Howard Thurman and Jesus and the Disinherited, and it's like, why could I not see this before? Because it's just so clear to me now. How does it say hidden so well? Is it just because it's all baked in and we're taught it, and we're just like, it's your diet, you eat it?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so this phrase, this is how this works. I forget who I'm borrowing that from, but it's evocative to me because it provokes questions for a lot of people. Yeah. What do you mean works? Right? What do you mean works? And I often tell the story of, like, my parents got divorced, and I grew up in a household with one of my parents had a violent temper. And as an adult, I had to learn how to name, this is what this parent's anger did. This is how it worked. Right? So, for instance, it created in me a deep sensitivity to how other people are feeling. Like, I read people's bodies and facial expressions, emotional temperatures. And I do that because my nervous system is trying to predict if Tom's going to get angry and I'll need to protect myself.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So how my parents' anger worked is it created a deep trauma response in me to dial in and key in on how other people are feeling so I could protect myself. It also worked by controlling people and getting people to orbit around this parent and trying to make them happy and trying to please them. So I was able to say, okay, this parent didn't just get angry. This anger did work, which is why it felt like a good idea to this parent, which is why this parent kept coming back to that strategy.
Yeah.
And when I say Mammon works, it does similar things. And I think it provokes us to get out of just like, how much money is too much money? Such a boring question to me. I don't care. How much money should I give away of my total income? Boring question. I don't care. But what kind of work does money want to do in the political economy of God? That's a much more interesting question to me. How does profit interfere with that work? Such a more interesting question to me. Right?
Yeah.
Such a more interesting question.
My brain exploded a little bit on that last one.
And I think they're deeply Christian questions. I think these are deeply Christian questions. You ask, why is this so hard to see? I think it's because this is how the principalities and powers work. This is how systems work well when you can't see how they work. Like an elegant system without, it doesn't take any conscious effort or conscious like involvement. We just get to be caught up in it. Think about driving down the road. My son's going to take in driver's ed. I'm able to talk on the phone, listen to music, plan the rest of my day, travel into the future in my head, travel into the past in my head, all while I'm driving, because my brain has made this really complicated driving thing almost like subconscious. I still have to make some conscious decisions, right? But slowing down at stop signs, accelerating from a stoplight, putting on my turn signal, how much to turn the wheel. You know what I mean? All of that is pretty much done without me having to burn a bunch of prefrontal cortex energy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Same thing with being in the shower. Same thing with cutting my dinner. Same thing with emptying the dishwasher. So systems work best when they make things unconscious so that you can do other stuff. And I think just as our bodies are a system, a complex system that do that with tasks, so cultural systems work, I think, with the same kind of efficiency. And so things like white supremacy and mammon and patriarchy and other systems that are just baked into whatever, they work best when they don't have to be explicitly all the time, when they just are carried by artifacts, habits, logics, common senses, etc. etc.
Yeah. Man.
And I'm trying to amplify voices who are able to see these systems better than me because they're on the wrong end of them. If they're, if it's mammon, they're poor or exploited. If it's white supremacy, they're not white. If it's patriarchy, they're not a white cisgendered male. And say, they run into these things all the time. I posted something on my Facebook wall today about a sign in Vancouver that was like, whites only mom and tots hang out.
I saw that and I just said, is that real?
It's real. Wow. It's real, and it's from current day. And white people, I had the same response. So white people, I'm with you. When I see that, I think that can't be from today, just like you said, Tom. And then my first instinct is to be shocked.
Mm-hmm.
But most of my Black, brown, Asian, indigenous friends who have some awareness of racial injustice, they're not shocked. They're not shocked.
That was like real-time revelation right there for me. Real-time revelation.
Yeah. They're not shocked at all. It's like, of course. Yeah, of course this. Yeah. And they're shocked that I'm still shocked. Like, can't you see this now?
Oh, God.
Like, would you do me a solid and stop being shocked by blatant white supremacy? And so this is why I sort of work hard to excavate how things work, because I don't want to be shocked anymore that we live in a mammon dominated, by the way, mammon created white supremacy, in my opinion. White supremacy was an economic necessity to justify taking people's lands and colonizing people's bodies for the extraction of wealth.
Yes.
Without slavery being profitable, it doesn't exist the way it did.
Yeah.
It still exists, but it doesn't exist in the way, the generational, extractive, raping, genocidal way it did. Anyway, all that to say, I'm trying to see things the way that culture and society is set up for me not to see them. And it's just hard work, dude.
Mm-hmm. It is. And you just gave me a real-time revelation of it there. When you're like, you're shocked. Everyone's shocked. These people are not shocked. When are you going to stop being shocked? And it's like, and I've done work in this area. the last 2 years, I've really dug into it.
Yeah.
And it just shows that there's still a long way to go. I'm in that dark room feeling where the walls are.
Yeah. Well, I think this is how we love our neighbor.
Mm-hmm.
This is really how we love our neighbor, bro.
We gotta learn from our neighbor.
Yep. We listen to them. We follow their lead.
I'd like to kind of close out with another quote that you had on your Facebook wall that really I think illustrates it. And I think it's a good way to close this out. You said, I'm reminded again today that 62 of the wealthiest people on earth have more money than the bottom half of the human population combined, which is 3.5 billion people. And 2, most Christians are too busy with the moral panic du jour to do anything about this. Many are impressed by it. Most of us benefit directly by gross wealth inequality, mammon at work. You want to say any closing remarks about that?
Yeah. I think that in order to see the sickness, the syncretism of mammon, I think facing a stark reality that we valorize wealth. Rich people deserve to be rich. They must be smart. They must be good. They must be savvy. They're envied. They're put on pedestals. They're given magazine covers, interviews. They're trusted. If they lie or cheat or commit 81 federal crimes, as long as they agree with me, it's fine, right? I think I want to be re-scandalized by a disproportionate accumulation of wealth, because I believe that Jesus spoke to and taught and died and rose again to create a different way of being human.
Can I just say amen? And wow. Yeah. I'm going to hit stop on that one because that's just, we gotta end it on that. That's good. Well, thank you so much for joining us on the Liminal Living podcast. I hope your brain exploded a couple times. I hope the brake cleaner got on the cut and you're like, oh, there it is. And now you have something to look at, something to see, something hidden within you that needs to be brought into the light was shown. That definitely happened for me. I love that concept of honest conversation, learning in public, and just that experiment that Matt is all about is really cool. I urge you to go check out Matt's Facebook page. He has got some pretty amazing stuff that he posts there quite a bit. And make sure to head over to IVP and look for his book there and download that or buy it as paper copy or whatever. Give him a like and a follow on all his socials. You're going to definitely love the journey that Matt takes you down, and it'll be a little bit painful too, but in a good way. So we will see you next week, and blessings on the journey, my friends.